In this brief presentation, I will address the materials and techniques I use in developing these multi-hued stories, focusing especially on my most recent graphic fable, Mumbi the Long Run. In creating this series, I've tried out several different strategies for showing differences among people. In this image from my second book, Mona and the Little Smile, you can see how I've drawn varied features on these faces so that racial variations are apparent even though the art is black India ink on white illustration board.
Maureen.
Yeah.
I ask you to turn your
just the monitor.
so that you can face us.
Yeah.
That's a brilliant idea.
And then we can see the images and you can look at them on your screen. How's that? Okay.
People swing toward the right or my left, I guess. So,
Yeah, you need to move over some.
yeah, feel free to take it over.
Yeah. That way the camera can see it.
Okay. Hi.
Nice job.
So only the cover art for the first three fables had color added digitally in Photoshop. Also, each book contains several pages in full color at the beginning and end with the main kind of black and white meat of it in the center. And then I created those color pages in each fable using various media. In Magda and the Missing, which was my first book, oil paintings depict women who were raped and murdered in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. I chose oil on canvas for these pages because typically oil portraits are only done of an elite class. But by turning thumbnails of these young women's faces, which I found on posters and on the internet, into oil paintings, I wanted to honor and cherish the memory of who these women had been before they became victims of the horrendous crimes. In the opening and closing pages of Maisa and the Most Daring Muslim Girls, I show Maisa, a Turkish protagonist, fighting demons. I used voluptuous layers of pastels on paper. And in creating these pastels, I was riffing off of art from 14th century Persia, as you see here, attributed to someone they call Muhammad of the Black Pen, and they have actually been several different artists working over the course of 100 years. These images were done in velvety earth tones and depicted wise men battling demons and creatures. So you can see the color images I did. I chose media that were very specific to the work that I was presenting. My most recent fable, completed this spring, Mumbi the Long Run, is Mumbi the Long Run. This fable addresses the issue of female genital mutilation, FGM. FGM is practiced on about 3 million girls annually in 28 African countries and in immigrant communities around the world, including the US. Each fable begins with much research and experimentation in terms of the theme, story, and material style. My main character doesn't usually come to me fully formed. Instead, I create many sketches, drawings, and paintings, trying out different media and ideas until I feel she is just right. When I began working on Mumbi, I was first drawn to scratchboard as a possible medium. I appreciated the intense, angsty mood created with scratchboard by comic artist Thomas Ott, for instance, and here you see one of Thomas Ott's images. I like the idea of representing dark skin in this way, using a sharp instrument to scrape away the black surface of the material, revealing the white board beneath. I experimented with chalk sketches on chalkboard as well to see if this might work. Eventually, I rejected this technique because I wanted a more buoyant and unbounded feeling in the story, which is ultimately a story of hope. I had to metamorphose my own feelings of horror and angst in response to FGM in order to convey a more hopeful message. The protagonist, Mumbi, originally I called her Bosi, is an international marathon runner from Kenya who uses her skills to create change for young women in her home village. I had been mining the internet and the library for information about canyon runners, but that didn't feel like enough. I ended up going to a canyon running camp in Santa Fe, New Mexico last summer, meeting canyon elite athletes. After spending time with the canyon runners who live and train in Santa Fe, the story came together for me. Sketching in my journal one morning, and it's just a notebook here, the final version of Mumbi, my protagonist, came to me with her big dimpled grin and electric braids. She even had a tattoo and a dingra symbol for charisma and leadership. I later had this symbol tattooed on my own forearm. So she influenced me. At first, I wanted to make the whole book in color. I created the first few pages using India ink washes and line work done with a brush and fine-tipped Copic pens. On top of that base, I laid down watercolor washes. But after I'd spent dozens of hours creating panels in color, I had to admit to myself that I was really unhappy with the results. So I started over. As a separate section of the book, a nonfiction section, I'd collaborated with Halima Mohammed, a Sudanese woman who had survived FGM. In creating the graphics around her text, I've used the same technique as in my other F-word fables, India ink washes and brush and pen work. I'd then added color digitally in Photoshop, the way I did with the cover images in the other book. This segment of the book was easier to complete for a number of reasons. For one, the story was already written for me, and I just had to translate it to the graphic narrative format and just put it into speech bubbles and text boxes. Also, I was working with Halima's concise descriptions. For instance, she told me the midwife who had done the cutting on her was light-skinned and wearing a white sleeveless dress. And I was working with image sources that Halima provided for me, including photos of herself and her daughter, so I had something to base the images on. But with the fictional segment of this project, I was drawing from my own dreams and experiences, piecing together what I knew and what I could imagine based on careful research. The digital colorization I'd done for my previous book covers and for Halima's story was really time-consuming, and I wasn't 100% happy with the result, finding the color a bit too slick and saturated looking for my taste. Should I work on a natural color paper? A nice idea, but I knew that such drawings like this one would be harder to scan and print and might not provide sufficient contrast in the end. I had also become aware of the fact that in previous versions of my protagonist, the skin tones I had created were much too light, in contrast to the Kenyans I had recently befriended. I also didn't want to rely just on features this time to portray Kenyans, leading readers to guess that the characters' skin tones were rich, deep umbers and siennas. I had been reading Stuffed Rubber Baby by Howard Cruz at the time, and I admired his technique of using cross-hatching to describe differences in skin tones. I decided to use a similar technique for the fictional segment of my project. Unlike Cruz, though, I began every drawing with subtle ink washes. On top of those ink washes, I lovingly laid down layers of overlapping lines, thus building up richly textured dark tones, showing this particular feature of the Kenyan bodies. I often spent several hours completing just one panel of the 32-page book. Here you can see a panel from one of the finished pages. You can see the subtle grays that I created by laying down ink washes in varied tones. On top of this, in the background, you can see how I've laid down some cross-hatching with a small brush behind the text panels at the top right, which are now in the process of being translated into Swahili. Then you can see the careful cross-hatching I've done with fine-tipped pens to create the skin tone and to give volume to the shoe, rocks, and mud. Finally, notice the ink spattering I've created as a final layer using a toothbrush dipped in ink right under the foot around the rocks to make it look muddy. Ultimately, Mumbi draws on her lion nature, on her leadership abilities, and wins the Berlin Marathon. She is thus able to fund an organization in her home village, which creates alternative rites of passage for girls, thus eliminating the practice of FGM in that village. In reality, of course, things don't always go so smoothly and end so tidily. But ultimately, this work does what I intended, both in terms of technique and story. It delivers a crisp, clear message. In an increasingly globalized world where young women must navigate a tangle of intersecting prejudices, dilemmas, and choices, I feel there's always at least some capacity for positive social change. Therefore, courage and leadership are hugely important. These slides have primarily focused on the materials and techniques I've used to depict racially varied features among people, but I feel I should say just a few words about the content of the project, which has also undergone much editing. In creating this book, in addition to library and online research, I've corresponded with people who have given me much critical feedback. After submitting my original sketches to Halima for her feedback, for instance, she had me make several changes. On the left, we see my first sketch of page 1 of Halima's story. I had assumed that a girl going through the FGM rite would be naked. However, Halima told me that the girls in Sudan wear festive garments and remain clothed to the waist. In the final art, then, I've adjusted to incorporate this new information. When I was planning to exhibit the art from Mumbi the Long Run in London this summer, I worked with a social worker and nonprofit organizations to organize a panel talk about FGM in London. I wanted to use the panel you see here for the flyer advertising this talk, but Mona Lisa Earle, the writer and social worker I was collaborating with, pointed out that the presence of the white lady with child in this drawing might be interpreted as meaning that people of color are not able to implement change without the presence of a white person sanctioning their actions. Even though the woman and child in my drawing are just passersby, I could see how, taken out of the story's context, it could be thus misunderstood. So I removed the white people from the picture. Ultimately, I was quite satisfied with the finished project, and the exhibition and panel were seen by a diverse audience in London. I have kept in close contact with Halima during and after these events, and we're still collaborating. She was very pleased when I sent her photos of the exhibition and pages containing visitors' comments. In an email recently, she wrote, "By giving this attention to my story, you are standing by the side of more than 14 million mutilated Sudanese women alone, and you are shouldering the task of being the spokeswoman for the silent, intimidated, and mutilated 40 million females from worldwide. You have delivered a very strong message to a large intellectual audience. Keep on the good job." It made me really happy. It's really heartwarming to get such feedback, and I appreciate the things I've learned through this collaboration and continue to learn in finishing this project. Ultimately, moving across racial and cultural barriers becomes increasingly possible with much communication and with the willingness to edit and reinvent. Thank you.